Okay, we're in Colossians chapter 3. We are picking up in verse 13, which is in the middle of a sentence even. And so we need to remind ourselves what Paul just said. The key element in something that is going to come up that we did not discuss, since we didn't get here last week, is what we had in verse 11 were these negative kind of things, saying things that should not be your identity. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all in all, in all. And so by doing that, he's saying that should not be what you are about. And so he then counters that in verse 12 and provides this different kind of identity that is character-oriented. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering. And as we looked at that list, these items of things that should define us in terms of character, one thing we did not discuss that is extremely pertinent for what we're doing now is why did he choose that particular group of words? When in other lists Paul gives, it's broader, this one has greater focus on it. Everything you look at and see in that list that we are to put on has to do with the character you need in your interaction with others. That specifically. Tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering. And the reason why that he has done that is because he's making a transition from where he has been in all of chapter 3, and he is now getting to this next part of it. He began by setting their perspective to be heavenly. Here's where you need to look for guidance on who you need to become. Then, beginning in verse 5, here are the things you need to kill off. Those things that you said you were repentant of, they need to be done and so far away you'd never have to revisit them. But then you need to also come over and work on these other issues that can creep into life and that you don't want as part of your life. Let go of those. Take them off. Put them away. And then he comes in and he says, after you've done all those things, now you need these characteristics. And we get this positive part. But the key thing when we now are looking ahead at the section that follows is he said these characteristics, and the next thing he does is say, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. Now those are actually different words, but they're similar in their function. If anyone has complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. So notice what's happened. He starts with understanding where we need to center ourselves and how we stand before God. And that always needs to be the foundation. But then we need to recognize in ourselves and reflect on ourselves, where are we with that relationship with God? Do we have things that are getting in the way of that relationship with God? Because we need to get rid of those things. And now, putting these other kind of characteristics in to improve that relationship, he's now turning us and saying, okay, the next step is building your character out so it's not just about me, but it's about your brethren. And you need to work on your character in such a way so that you are mindful all the time of how your behavior, your ideas, the way you think, how that affects everyone around you. And that's why he gave that list in verse 12. But now let's discuss then what he does in adding these other ideas to it, because he has character first in verse 12, and then behaviors that are associated or should be associated with those characteristics. You have to have those characteristics to really make these behaviors work. And he gives them after put on, right? That's an action. You have to get this part of you But here's what goes with it as it applies to others. Bearing with one another. What does it mean to bear with one another? Good, to put up with? That's exactly right. Put up with. To tolerate. You know, some people, well, I tolerate them. Why? You put up with them. The word is the idea of you hold up under a little bit of a burden. With some people, and I would say all people at different times, we all kind of create these small little burdens for one another sometimes. And he says you have to accept that, if you will, as the price of admission to relationship. That having to deal sometimes with these things that are more difficult, that kind of rub us the wrong way, that's part of dealing with other people who are not like you are. Now, he's already described some of these other things, remember in verse 11, that could easily divide if that becomes your identity. So he's first addressed that idea of letting that become your identity, and now he's coming on and around and saying, look, there are going to be certain things about other people that are different from who you are. But that should not be what defines you. You should be defined by being holy and beloved and elect, and having those character, so that then these other differences are now because you're pushing those things down the list of priority. The problem is we end up prioritizing all the wrong things. Have you ever seen what goes on nowadays when we talk about, and I promise I'm not going to get political, but identity politics, where you end up with this kind of what the correct order is for what you identify with, what gives you priority in the social kind of connection? The fact that y'all don't know what I'm talking about makes me feel very good. Because it's like you're trying to figure out how you're going to treat someone, and it's all based upon these external kind of things. The problem is just no. Those things need to be way down the list of how you even think about yourself. Here's how you should see yourself, and as you elevate character, then that means that these other things are not as important, and your behavior toward them then should be relative to how important those things are. Now, so I don't want any kind of, this is not an opportunity to don't tell too much on yourself or somebody else. But you always have some of those things that just annoy you. That certain people will do, right? They just annoy you. I always worry at this point where the people are going to say, oh, you know. But we have these, and there's a lot of times there's small things, and it can be rooted in your just how you were different, how you were brought up a little bit different. So, some people, the manner. I'll give you this example. People, when you go into different cultures, because that's one of the things he mentions, Scythian. You get into different cultures, having to adapt to the other culture, or expecting everyone to adapt to your culture, right? And we've seen a little bit about this with everyone visiting for the World Cup, right? Okay, but try doing that on the other way. Okay, because I found when I was in Hawaii, that was a very different culture. Very different culture. I'm going to be traveling to a couple of countries at the end of the summer. Different culture, and you have to be able to figure out what works there, what doesn't. Even within our country, what is acceptable in terms of the way you approach a particular problem and how direct you are is very different. Some places, it's just like right at you. Others, but said, okay, here's what you need to do. But it was said, with nice car, bless your heart. Right, so we can do that. Versus there's other places, you just kind of say, it just comes across as direct, and down here it'd be rude. And then there are some places where the nature of the culture is to talk around it and never get to the point. But that's kind of the culture, right? So you have to be aware of those. But there can also be smaller things, you know. If you are just something that just bothers you, physically bothers you, that's not wrong. Do we immediately, or we're spending our time making judgments about those things that absolutely have nothing to do with being wrong at all, but they just annoy me? Had a member of the congregation down at Granbury Street, and anytime football was brought up, he let you know that he was a Washington fan. And I said, I love you anyway. Okay? You know, it's just goading that, but he didn't even really follow football. He just liked to do that to people. Okay? So you say, but some people are prickly. Some people are not good with just that closeness. That's just not where they are. It's kind of like I want you to think about the difference about how close people can be in having a conversation. That's different for people. How comfortable they are, you know. Okay, don't do this to me. Right? How far should you be apart? That can be different. And whenever anyone gets in those situations, the point is, and then we're going to get really into the text, is to recognize all sorts of different kind of things and show respect for people that in something that doesn't, it's not a scriptural matter, to show respect for the other person. That's what he's getting to, is that don't force everyone to have to adapt to you. Now, so when he says bearing with one another, you're going to be annoyed from time to time. People are going to say things that you may think that they mean one way, and they may not have even had that in their minds at all. But you're having a bad day, and they were just needing to get away quick, and they said something, and now we're on the verge of having a tiff between people where there was nothing ever intended, but there wasn't appropriate kind of care. That's when we need to bear with one another. Tolerate it. Okay? Different kind of things. Hey, you know, some of y'all, how many, okay, we're going to do a poll now. How many of you are huggers? Hugger people, right? How many people are definitely not huggers? Okay? I don't see that come in your, I'm not sure what, how do you say that you are not a hugger? Because I know who you're married to. Because I'm thinking about, you've had to deal with it, right? Because all you non-huggers, how's your reaction when you see Kogas coming at you? Like you freeze up? Like, it's like a bear, you know, approaching. Okay. So you're trying to recognize that, hey, look, it can get worse because I know someone goes around kissing everybody, so it can get worse. I was expecting at least one ooh, okay. But that happens, okay. So the idea is what you have to do is you have to be knowledgeable about the other person, you have to care about them, and with one another, work that situation so you can tolerate in that, but both of you, this is the key idea when he says bearing with one another, that you each need to be committed to the relationship so that there's respect for what the other person's tolerances are. Not just yours. Not just, well, that's just him. Well, just him needs to start working at how he behaves with everybody else. Okay? That's the one another part. You can't be the person that everyone has to tolerate. That's not a good person in the church. Okay? So we have to deal with it. Okay. Now, the next one, it says, and forgiving one another. And here, they say, now we're dealing a little bit different category of things. Because here it was kind of you're tolerating just kind of idiosyncrasies, those kind of things, differences. Here it's a little bit different, but it is not the word you think it is. Typically, when we come up to these conversations about forgiveness, you end up with these two sides. Okay, you have the side of, they will run immediately to Luke 17, verse 3, and it says that if someone sins and repents, you forgive him. And then we come to the people who come here and says, no, it says you need to just be forgiving and you don't worry about the other person, because then you get the little memes. It's more, forgiveness is more about you than the other person. Okay. That person doesn't know the Bible, ignore them. Because it's two different separate things, okay? One word that's found in Luke is about sending the sin away and treating it as if it's been sent away. That's not what this word is even talking about. That has to do and is focused on the sin and where that other person stands with God. You do not have the right to forgive someone of something that God has not forgiven. You understand what kind of situation that puts you in? To act like you're sending that sin away that God says is still there? Okay? That's not it. So what is this then? This is the word that I might translate as acting graciously towards or acting favorably towards. And the point is behavior, which is the bearing has the idea of handling things and not just it's coming at you. It's a response, okay, to what someone else is doing. Bearing, tolerating. It's a response inside. But this word is a positive behavior toward people from you. So on one end, you are to be bearing maybe some negative behavior from someone else. But then the other responsibility is to be demonstrating positive behavior toward other people. All right? That's why these two appear together. One, you've got something bad going on, negative in some way, kind of shoulder the load. Don't immediately respond. Don't immediately go right back at them. You handle it. But here it is, you got someone who is weaker and maybe has done something even wrong. Okay? But your responsibility is to act favorably to them. That does not mean act like if they've done something wrong, act like it is okay. That's not what this word means. This is about treating people so well that you have an environment around you that is favorable to others and makes that environment possible so that forgiveness can happen. You don't just toss people aside because of things they've done and you tolerate certain things. And then you positively do things to try to set an environment where they can respond in a better way. Think about the proverb, a soft answer turns away wrath. That's one kind of subset of this idea. You act graciously toward, act favorably toward. You're trying, in what Jesus did, turn the other cheek. That's gracious behavior. It's the opposite of needing to retaliate. What do? We tolerate, don't retaliate. And then, on the other side, we throw it in with the positive to try to see if we can get positive back. Not because it's a trick. We're not trying to do some kind of psychological trick. We're trying to create an environment that shifts for them how they see us in the church in Christ. So all of this, you'll notice though, is one another, and therefore he's not talking about things going on outside. He's talking about within a congregation. He's describing then behaviors that are central to making a congregation work and making the relations work. Otherwise, you end up with little pockets of people. Okay? So you got this pocket of people, and they all get along. That's not the real challenge, right? The challenge in any congregation is we're going to mix those pockets up. And now we got to figure out how to get along with people that we don't know that well, or that we're not naturally in the same kind of interest level to. That's where your challenges are. Bearing with one another and forgiving one another. Key elements of that. If anyone has a complaint against another, or the idea here is is some reason to blame somebody, right? So someone's done something. Okay, so this is getting away from pointing fingers all the time and figuring out who's to blame. You know how easy it is? The first instance can be if we don't want to know who's to blame. I mean, whenever our team loses, the first thing we'll think about sometimes is who's to blame. Something goes wrong in government, well, who's to blame? I didn't say we were very good at understanding these things, but we do it. Okay? Company, who's to blame? So that's why you end up with scapegoats, right? Because somebody has to be to blame. If anyone has a complaint or a cause to blame against another, here's what you do. Even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. It's the same word. Even as Christ acted graciously toward you, so you also must do. All right, what did Jesus do for you? How far did acting favorably go? John? Yes. Yes, sir. If nothing else, you're pulling people together. You have to understand that you're pulling people when someone went in there, okay, you're pulling people together who's never been a unit before. They're a new congregation. They've been pulled together. They don't even know one another very well. And now they've got to operate a bond. And that's what he's doing. He's helping them learn the coping skills and the bonding skills necessary to then operate as the Lord's church in Colossae. Even as Christ forgave. How far did Jesus go with acting graciously to people? He went to the cross. That's how far. So we tend to set our limits, and we need to realize that what we're trying to do is, the reason why, I don't think it's because we're bad people. I think it's because we don't understand the end in mind. We don't have in mind what I'm trying to accomplish with this person is I want them to be in the fold and stay clear in the fold and strong in the fold of what the possibilities are with this person. They're weak now. You know what's a joyful thing? I just learned this yesterday. Someone that I taught the gospel through, others connected us. I did the Bible studies, then baptized this person, and then taught for a year afterwards trying to strengthen them. This person, for the first time, taught someone else the gospel. I was so excited. Well, that really got me excited. And it's like, you go and you look at these things and say, yeah, there could be a long time and a hard road to get to that. So we have to be willing to walk the hard road too. And that requires a lot of forbearance and a lot of forgiveness. Okay? Verse 14, it's going to build on this now. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Now, do you see that verb now? We've seen it before. Put on. That shows you he still is operating within the very same kind of idea of, if you see what is going on here, is what he's trying to accomplish. Upon all these things, love. The put on is going back to the previous one. But by doing that, the illustration is all these characteristics you're kind of putting on internally, right? You're doing this, and then we're got our in graciousness and our forbearance. But then love, that is like the overcoat. That's the kind of overarching thing that encompasses all these others. So when he says then that you are to, above all these things, or upon would be better, upon all these things put on love, and then he even gives the reason why, which is the bond of perfection. That's an interesting word for someone in prison to use. Because that's what he's talking about. Things that are chained together. Love is what chains things together. And what does it chain things for? Perfection. I'm going to give you a different word here, though, also that goes with this idea. The core meaning of this word is completeness. But I want you to think about it for what he's doing and talking about. It's maturity. Because love, ultimately, if we review all the way, if y'all can remember back to 1 Corinthians and to 1 John. Because love, this is agape love, in terms of motivation, as from God himself, is a motivation to establish and maintain relationships even when it didn't exist previously. So love is what calls all these other characteristics into action, if you will. Okay, you have all this on, and the hard thing sometimes is, okay, I've got to be humble, I've got to be kind, I've got to tolerate, got to be gracious. Okay, got to pull all these up individually, right? Or love is actually the core of every single one of these characteristics we've been discussing. So the more you integrate love and understand what love does, as he's just described, it can become more natural. But again, it's about the willingness to create relationships where it doesn't exist previously. The willingness to do what it takes to get that person closer, to maintain that relationship when things are difficult. Well, that's what he just covered in verse 13. So you have the characteristics to build a relationship, but you've got to also build the characteristics to maintain a relationship. You got to have both. You know, in doing marriage counseling over the years, it's not, people don't need all the kind of maybe specific things. Let me explain to you a few little things that will work on you, and maybe over time I can get you to fall in love. That's not usually what happens, right? You get them, they're in love. What they lack a lot of times are the staying in love, maintaining love issues. Those are the problems people have. It's true in the church too. It's the bond. It's what makes maturity, ties everything together. Love is what ties all of these characteristics and makes it one. Verse 15. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. The peace of God. Now, whenever you see a term like that, you say, okay, what's he talking about when he says peace of God? Is he talking about God being at peace? Is he talking about God offering peace? Is he talking about peace that comes from God? Which is it? Well, if you look contextually at what he's been doing, he's trying to get them to be at peace, isn't he? Isn't that what he's concentrating on? He's just saying that the kind of peace that you are seeking, that only comes from God. And doing things, that means that if it comes from God, it means you need to do things God's way if you're going to get that kind of peace. But the word, though, that will help it pull out was when he says, and let the peace of God rule in your hearts. Now, I think I've asked this before, but when you say the word heart in the Bible, everyone knows, what is that not talking about? Okay, the thing pumping blood. Okay, so what is it talking about? Okay, the mind. But there are several other words for mind, though, in Greek. Several. So what specifically does he have in mind when he talks about, sorry to the pun, when he says heart? About the nature of the mind. Well, but he has a word for that too, John. Heart typically is used as the combination of emotion and will. Because it is, when you see it, typically it's in places where there is a decision to be made. And what you're allowing to help you make those decisions, or you'd say inform those decisions. So what he is doing in this context is let the peace of God rule in your heart. So if within you, as you are now all affected by emotions and thoughts that come through here about what you're going to do, you have a decision to make. Now, the word here, when it says rule, is actually a very specific word. It kind of has the idea, and that you may have, I'm going to warn you, you may have mixed feelings about this term if you're a sports fan, because it's about letting an umpire rule. Okay? Good thing is if you're letting the peace of God rule, it's always the right call. That's how you have to understand it. So what he's saying is, when there's a decision to be made about what to do, in all these situations, your heart, all of these situations are heart situations. You're one another situations. It's brotherly situations. Things are kind of difficult situations. What are you going to do? Let the peace of God make the decision as to what you should do. Now, here is something that I wish that we could really learn. Because what he's saying is, starting at the congregational level, but it applies brotherhood level too, is that before you do something and you react and overreact to someone for either an idiosyncrasy or a sin, you need to make sure that in everything what you're doing for your approach, that the peace of God that he wants for his people is front and center in the decision you make. That we don't go in and just say, I'm going to go and clean house. Or I don't care what anybody thinks, that person needs to be told off. Or I'm going to make sure and do this because I know I'm right. Well, are we measuring within all of that what God actually wants for his people? The problem is what it shows is we failed to prioritize the church. Remember I talked about the priorities earlier? Prioritizing your relationship with God. I think a lot of people can get that down. But then we end up picking at people. And we don't prioritize the church. Now, I say that understanding that we're going to have issues. There's going to be disagreement, and we're going to have to work on some problems and some differences, doctrinally included, sin included. The point is how we do it. And if we go out and we don't consider how I deal with this one brother and how that affects everybody else in the church, we've failed on the job. Or if I do something and I haven't considered how it affects the brotherhood, and I just go start lobbing doctrinal bombs everywhere, I haven't considered what's good for the church. So it's a tremendous task until we just start thinking that way of here's what I need to consider. And so the question is, it automatically forces us, okay, here's why. It forces us, in seeing the peace of God ruling in our hearts, to pick the absolute best way to handle it we can. Not the easiest way for us to handle it, which is your natural default, whether you want to admit it or not. We all have this kind of easy way to handle it, and that's rarely the best way to handle it. So we have to stop and think, okay, this is my priority. So before I do this, how does this affect everybody else? How does this affect the church? What am I doing in the process of doing this that not only will help this individual and address this problem, but it'll also be good for everyone else? When you think about it, this is exactly what Paul prioritized in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 in dealing with church discipline. He didn't say don't address sin, now did he? He said you have to address sin. But he said here's how to do it. And if in the process of how to do it, it was with that person's soul in mind and to save that soul. And then also remember in 2 Thessalonians to remember that that person's a brother. And then it's also about, back to 1 Corinthians 5, about understanding the unique places within the church and the influence that can have. All of those have to be considerations. How I handle this, what's it going to do to the individual in sin? If it doesn't ever address the sin, then I've failed. If it leaves the wrong impression about sin to the congregation, I've failed. If I've dealt with it so harshly that now other people are just going around and being harsh to everyone and it's all kind of now a fight, I've failed. If I've done it in such a way and made this such an issue that now we're just going to go everywhere and cause problems, we failed. But the failure doesn't happen up there. It happened because we did not train ourselves to think in terms of the peace of God. Notice, the peace of God is disrupted by sin. It's disrupted by error. But it also is showing us how to handle both. Because you should handle it for the welfare of the church and all involved. Not just in what's easiest, not just in what is your natural inclinations, but to deal with things in such a way that we can kind of create unity. Because notice, Because notice the second part, to which also you were called in one body. You catch that? He already had talked about how they were elect, right? Select, which has to be called out too. You were called. That's the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel calls you to be in one body, to be unified as an organism and acting as one. So what he's pointing out is all of this I've been talking about is completely in line and keeping with what you were taught originally. You were called to enter this group of people that are God's people and to be united and act as a unit and to treasure what you have. And be thankful. This isn't, and be thankful is not some generic throw-in line. Just be thankful, people. Be a thankful person. We can go to 1 Thessalonians, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. That's not what he's talking about here. You're to be thankful for how God has called you, what he called you to, that he called you to unity, that he called you in the church, and that he called you to behave better than you were before, and to unite and to work on you to make that happen. That's the challenge. I don't know how many people exactly are here in the auditorium right now, but I know this. Whatever number that is, that's at least the number of opinions we have. And we have to be able to work through those. Everyone has a different background, spiritually, socially, different. We're not all the same person. But we are all to be Christ's. And when we start putting that up and the high thing on our list in our way we interact with relationships, the way we interact with one another, and the way in which we prioritize what we're doing for the benefit of the congregation and the church, that's when everything allows for that unity, starts being a beautiful thing, where it's not just we're good people. I'm not doubting that at all. But to be good people who are friendly is still not the whole of what he says we're to do here. Because those are social obligations. These are spiritual obligations. And the church is a spiritual organization first that creates a community. And because we have the right spiritual center and behavior, it makes that community and the social part so strong and pleasant. And when the church in a given congregation or brotherhood as a whole is not pleasant, I want you to come back to these verses, because this is why. That's why. Now, what's the problem with this thesis I have just presented to you? How easy is doing all of this? Going to take some work, right? And I'd say it never will not be work. Because these are hard things to do. Because sometimes they're fighting against what is maybe natural. What are just impulsive characteristics. And that's what discipline is. Discipline is about learning to do the things that are not natural. And become so well practiced at them that they appear so. Now, the bell's about to ring, so I have one last thing to do. We just covered about how difficult some of this can be and why it's been a problem. But I want you to think about this. Isn't it worth it? However hard any of this is, to have the church operating at, I'll call it peak capacity. Peak emotional capacity, spiritual capacity, social capacity. To be so inviting, people don't know what happened when they walk in the door. Isn't that worth it? I think so. I do not have time, because that was the bell, to get into verse 16. Unfortunately, I'm going to be gone the next 2 weeks. But you have capable people who will be here. Capable people. I need to work harder at being here. Thank you. I'm not even going to say that that's bad advice. We've actually had that conversation recently. But give me 2 weeks. Important stuff. And we'll come back and we're going to pick up in verse 16.